I know this, that I come from a family where books, writing, the arts, the fine arts were not very present, and it wasn't a big part of my growing up, my culture. And yet I was attracted first to the visual arts as a very little boy, and I was an avid reader, and spent a lot of time by myself, fantasizing and reading and reading. Eventually reading became almost a drug for me. But I showed some sort of aptitude, I guess, or interest in writing and drawing. And I drew, and my mother, not really knowing what to do with this, had heard that there was a program at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston where you would go and you would learn to paint or something. But I had to have been 6 or 7. And maybe even smaller, and they would bring us to the museum and walk us around, and we would look at things like Egyptian mummies, and then we'd go back to this little room, stuffy little room, and make watercolor paintings of these things. And I remember it so strongly because I had no idea where I was, why I was doing these things. I was not learning any craft. We just were given some paints. And I kept these paintings for a long time of things that I didn't even know what I was painting, what the thing was. It would be some little box. And they didn't tell us either. And so there was a sort of mysterious quality to the arts for me. And in fact, when I was in high school, I started acting in plays and had never been to a play. I grew up in pretty much a blue-collar town, although my family is not blue-collar. We come from a sort of a newer part of town. My father was a bookkeeper, my mom was a hairdresser, but there were a predominance of kids in my school who would go on to serve time and to make license plates and things like that. And sure enough, in the late 60s, when I was getting to the end of high school, I romanticized the blue-collar quality of my town and made a point of hanging with those kinds of kids and being with the people from the other side of the tracks and all that color. And I was rejecting what I had become affiliated with, which was sort of the honor society and being the kid who always raised his hand in English class, things that weren't cool anymore by the time I was a senior in high school. I'm a classic working class kid as far as the arts go because I had more of an idea about it rather than any real, anything learned how to do it. I just knew that it would be really cool to be a writer, and I wanted to be a writer. I just never wrote anything, and I had no one teaching me or even encouraging us to write. I went to the University of Chicago in 1971, having never written a paper before I went to college. And when they gave us assignments to write, I didn't know what that, I didn't know how to even begin. So I would just write. I remember a course, there was a class, German Romantics of the late 19th century. How did I end up in that class? Well, I had taken some German in high school, so this seemed interesting to me. It was a graduate course. I had no idea what they were talking about. I slowed the whole, and so when the question of, for instance, discussing naturalism vis-a-vis romanticism, I wrote this long thing about what I thought the word naturalism might mean, which had something to do with being natural or nature or that sort of thing. So I was really starting from nowhere, and it was in Chicago where, although I struggled, I did keep my grades up. I was frightened. I had never been anywhere where I wasn't the smartest person in the room or in the football stadium or wherever I was. I mean, they called me the professor in my hometown, and nothing against those guys. I mean, later on I realized they were just as smart as anyone. It's just that it was a different culture. But here I was in Chicago, and there were all these kids who had gone to prep schools and had competed to get into this school. And I actually had an identity crisis in the midst of this because if I couldn't be this, what could I be? I mean, there were things I knew I wasn't any good at, sports and getting girls or any of those kind of things. But I knew that I was smart. And here I was in Chicago. So I really buckled down. But they had these things called core courses, and you had to take all these different divisions which included philosophy, sciences, and the arts. And I had long ago left behind the dream of having anything to do with the arts, or specifically visual arts. I think in the 7th grade, my teacher had said to my parents, this is something he should definitely pursue. And my parents sat me down that night when they got home from the parent-teachers meeting, and they said, your teacher says that this is something you should do, and of course that's out of the question. You would never, you can't do that. A classic second-generation kid of immigrants, that you're going to be a doctor, you're a smart boy, all this stuff. So I took this course on Renaissance art. Again, working class kid, I didn't know what Renaissance art meant. It sounded cool. Renaissance, it's a big word, it means something about art. The teacher inspired me. He got very excited about, in a way that I think there was genuine love in his part of the work of the Italian Renaissance. And this began a journey for me of teaching myself about this, and eventually working my way all the way up through the modernists on my own, and into eventually the people who were contemporary and working in New York at the time that I arrived in New York. And I ended up arriving right in the midst of the thick of the Soho Renaissance of its own. And I worked in the epicenter of all of this, a place called The Kitchen, which just happened to be that I had met somebody. Like most things in my life, I knew and had heard about it, but it didn't mean anything to me. I just heard that The Kitchen is a cool place. If you go work there, that's a cool place. I thought it was some big art center. At the time, they had one video camera, which is a big empty loft. And what's strange is that I went to work there, and because the people who ran it were at some sort of point in their career, they were all approaching 30. They were very old compared to how old I was at the time. They needed to go and do things, like go to India or take a sabbatical or something. And everybody chose to do this at the exact same time. And there was only one guy who knew where everything was in this place, and that was me. And I had just been working there for 1 year as like the kid who answered the phone. And in effect, I became the guy running this place, The Kitchen. I started a dance program there for dancer friends I knew. I had gotten a theater degree at Oberlin in the meantime, and I was very interested in dance. And we also had other assistants who were coming to, who had also been sort of hanging around there. And chief among them was a guy named Robert Longo, who later became big deal in the 80s art world. So, and his girlfriend was Cindy Sherman, and she worked at a place called Artist Space. And the next thing I knew, I was hanging around with all these young artists who had very strong ideas about basically a reaction to what had been happening in the art world. Art world had gotten very conceptual, had gotten very heady, and these guys wanted to make images, and this was a sort of a revolution at the time, in the late 70s. And I was part of this group, but I was a theater person, but none of them knew anything about the theater. And I didn't like the theater that I had been exposed to in New York. It seemed staid and boring and too commercial. So here I was with these artists, and they were making this stuff, and there were even these people called performance artists, which I will protest again and again. I'm not a performance artist. I'm a theater. I'm an actor originally. I basically acted at Oberlin, but eventually I started writing things for myself and writing things for other people too. I wrote about 16 short pieces between 77 and 80, and around 80, 79 or 80, just as a sort of a finger exercise, I wrote a set of monologues for myself as an exploration of all the characters who lived inside of me. It was like an inventory. It was, you're an actor, you seem to just pull these people out of nowhere. Where do they come from, and how do you know what they're going to say? So I taped what I was saying when I would improvise as them, and I said, well, you can't have an infinite number. You actually have a set that you kind of seem to know. So, like, there's a kind of a macho guy inside of me, there's a fey guy inside of me, there's this, that. So what I would do is I would just let these guys go and let them talk and speak for themselves. And the visual artist crowd that I've been around, very interested in archetypes. What are the archetypes that transcend our culture and that we all know instantly? So I was looking for archetypes in these characters. Not stereotypes, but something that just, everyone knows that guy, but in a fully fleshed out way. So I started collecting these guys, and I came up with about a dozen, and I called the piece Men Inside, and I did it one night at Franklin Furnace on Franklin Street in Tribeca. And it was a big hit. And honestly, I was starving at the time. I mean, really, we were at that place, living in a storefront, and I had many things I wanted to work on, but look, if people want to pay me to do this thing and do these 12 guys, let's do it. And I would get $50 here, $100 there to do this little routine. And as I did it more and more, I learned how to write. I basically was editing, and I was learning about humor. They were very serious when I first wrote them, but when I did them in front of audiences, the timing and the pauses and everything taught me about, if you do it this way, they're going to laugh. And it feels good to have them laugh. And a lot of the material I was working at the time and went on to work on more was quite harsh. And so I loved this idea of, which I thought of as Brechtian, as being inviting, but at the same time very harsh. So I could do it. For instance, I mean, one of the pieces from that time called The Specialist, I can't believe that I called it The Specialist, is about a soldier in another country teaching another group of soldiers exactly how to place the electric wires on someone you're interrogating. This is circa 1980. And if you could read it today, it's what's going on in Iraq right now. And because I think some of these things, again, archetype, the American culture hadn't changed that much. And a lot of the things that are operant in our culture are persistent. So at any rate, there I was with this monologue thing. And I ended up doing it at the Public Theater with Joe Papp, kind of to amuse him. But again, it again got more attention. And it got so much attention that Joe asked me to do something else the following year. And basically, you know, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. I wrote another solo. However, I was becoming more desperate through this time. So I wrote an even more desperate and bleaker piece called Funhouse. And now I started getting some critical attention from the gray lady. And that was a big deal. I didn't know it was a big deal. I was so far from the realm of acting, movies, the media, although that's sort of what I was trained as, that I didn't know who Frank Rich was. I didn't really know it made any difference if the New York Times, I just wanted to get reviewed. I just wanted somebody, I was coming from a more art forum kind of world, and I just wanted somebody to critique what I was doing seriously. So here I was, and I did that piece, and that worked out well as well. The following year, Joe said, I went in to meet with him, and he said, I just want you to know we can't do any more of these solos. Everybody wants to do a solo here now. We do plays here. We do new American plays, and I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't do it. Justin Hoffman wants to do a solo. We're not going to do it. So I said, okay, fine. And I went through a big change in my life. I stopped drinking. I stopped using drugs and things. I had gotten very deeply into this New York City demi-monde thing. And I was sort of in these sort of grim shallows without a oar, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. I was kind of lost. And I wrote yet another solo called Drinking in America. And I ran into Michael Feingold, and he said, those others were great. When are you going to do this new one? And I said, I have nowhere to do it. He said, you should meet Win Hanman. And I went and I did it at American Place Theater. And this was a bona fide hit by any stretch of the imagination in New York. It ran for 4 months. It was sold out every night, and I had sort of arrived. Joe Papp came to my dressing room one night, and he said, that was wonderful. Why did you leave us? This is, if you know anything of Joe Papp, this is very Joe Papp. I said, well, you told me to get lost, basically. He said, no, come back. Whatever you want to do, whatever. And again, time and circumstance weighted in my favor because this was the end of the great era of the public theater, that particular era where they had money, it was really the end. The chorus line was just winding down. And he could do that. He could do whatever he wanted. And I said, well, there's this play I'm thinking about called Talk Radio. I've written 30 pages. I showed him the 30 pages. This is before workshops, stage readings, table work, all this junk. Went into the schedule, bang. Talk Radio, January 1987. And and it wasn't even written. There was 30 pages of some guy talking to people on the radio, a talk radio host. And I made it into a play. I was doing rewrites the night we started. I was reading them off the table. 1 year later, a film had been made with Oliver Stone, and again, all sorts of energy was happening. And I made a decision at that point. I don't know whether I guess I made it consciously, that I had come this far embracing an expressive form of what I do, whether you call it writing or whatever it is, that was not, I wasn't fully part of the media machine, which I was suspect of. And I really liked that they paid me all this money, and I really liked that they made this movie, and I was very, very proud of talk radio as a film. However, I didn't move to LA, I didn't take every job, I didn't go on location and make movies for, now I would do them actually, but at the time I had bigger fish to fry, and I had another play to write, and I had more solos to write, and that became what I ended up doing through the 90s, and gaining great satisfaction from that. And in a way, talk radio kind of said, he does more than a solo, and because it wasn't a solo, it was a play with 14 people in it, and Suburbia ended up at Lincoln Center. And I continue to write plays since that time, and I continue to learn how to write. The most recent chapter in what's going on with me is that in the last 10 or so years, it's been harder and harder for me to get my plays produced in New York, despite the successes that I've had. I don't know, I mean, off-Broadway has changed, the public has, when I say the public theater has changed, the price of tickets has changed, whatever it might be. Maybe my writing is awful. I'm not going to try to figure it out. All I know is I'm spending a lot of time writing plays, and I can't, if you don't have them produced, and they were produced out of New York, but they weren't produced in New York, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's my community, then how do I show them? And around this time, over the last 10 years, I became aware that something was happening in the book world that was very exciting, and it has very much to do with the internet, because due to the way people can get their hands on books, these huge niche audiences were building, and they built to this critical mass, and all of a sudden there was a new crop of writers trying new things. I was a big fan of the likes of, and we've been talking about this today, Russell Banks, Robert Stone, Don DeLillo. These were guys who were heroes to me, but they were part of a tradition of, you write a book and it goes in the bookstore and you're a serious novelist. Suddenly there were these guys who were rather playful, like David Foster Wallace and Dave Eggers, and these guys, although I didn't feel an affinity with them because I'm older than these guys, they were finding a youthful audience that, I just feel that the arts need to have like a good give and take between the audience and the maker, and that it isn't, I'm speaking from on high and you get my wonderful book, but that there's something going on with me that's probably going on with you, and when you read the book you feel that energy. And there had been that aspect to what I had been doing. I had been kind of embraced by the establishment, but I had some very fervent fans for the solos and for the plays. And I like that feeling of, we're talking about something here, something that's important to us. I don't claim to be the world's greatest writer. I don't claim to be a particular interesting stylist, or, I mean, I know who knows how to write, and I love their work. But what I do think I have to contribute is that I've gone out and I've grabbed the world by its horns or ass or tail or whatever and fooled around with it enough that I can come back and we can have this dialogue about my experiences with this. And I think that's to me the very romantic notion of a writer, the experience and all of that. And so at any rate, I happen to be talking to an old editor of mine who just happens to run a major publishing company today. And I was complaining about how everybody and his brother thinks they can write a book, and most of them are awful. And he said, you should write a book. And I sat down and I wrote Maul, and now I've just completed another novel. And I love the process of writing, and I'm in a, for whatever reason, I'm in such a place that I actually can write what I want to write. I'm not thinking so much about who am I going to please. Actually, I don't think I'm going to be able to please anybody. Anytime I try to please somebody, I fail miserably. And you don't go write books to make money. At least I don't. I can write TV pilots, or I can write, and I can spend a lot less time and make a lot more money. So, and I still do that, but more and more, especially with last year, I received a Guggenheim, and it really has helped me realign my sort of aesthetic compass or my work compass and say, I know what I want to do, and it's really up to me to do it, and I'm going to do this. The hardest thing for me with writing, despite the fact, well, first of all, I don't know how to write, so I continue to learn, just like I was learning as a freshman at the University of Chicago. I have to teach myself some of the basics, which would be obvious to most writers, but even learning how dialogue falls out on a page, I had been reading it for years, but I never noticed how you shift gears through that. And I wanted very much to write in both Maul and Wasted Beauty. I write in third person, or Wasted Beauty is mostly third person. I think of that as hard, or I think of that as the true novel. And then in the case of Wasted Beauty, I wrote it, I don't even know what the tense is, but it's active, it's present tense. I describe what's happening as it's happening to activate the book even more. In fact, I had written the whole book and then went back and changed the whole tense of it, which was really hard to do. But the hardest thing, beside the fact that I don't know how to write, is that physically I find it really difficult. And I've always done very physical performances, and I love some of my film stuff has been physically very challenging. But sitting in a chair and staring at a cathode ray tube for 3-4 hours a day, I tell you, my eyes are gone. My fingers, I'm getting some kind of arthritis or something. My back, everything. It destroys me, and I have to actually give myself the time to recuperate from the writing, and that's where I'm at. I love the process of writing a book for the simple fact that I have a great deal of what seemed to me to be thinking, sort of streams of words and thoughts every day going through my mind that seem highly original and very present and fresh and new, and I commit them to paper, and they come out as cliched and stale, and the wrestling with this and trying to really claw out what is original, or what is the me of me, what is my song that I sing to myself every day and put it on that page, is so challenging and wildly exciting. And in fact, if for no other reason than to go through this whole process, oh my God, at this exciting moment, and turn around and go back and read some of the writers who I find most exciting and realize even more what they've done. I mean, one of my favorites is the Rabbit books by Updike, and what appears to be it's just the most mundane goings on day to day, and the way he gets at it with language, but not so much language like jumping all over you while you're reading it, but kind of helping you along through the story and the images. Paul Roth, Sabbath Theater is one of my favorite books. It's a vast frontier for me to go exploring it, and it's really exciting. And I continue to write plays. I hope that I'll get my plays produced again someday, but if not, I won't be the first guy that wrote a bunch of plays and had them work out and then didn't get produced anymore. It's just the way it goes. And that's my story.